If you allow evil to go unpunished, it will fester and grow in communities. Left unchecked, it may even become difficult to distinguish good from bad, right from wrong.
Let's begin.
As the Israelites journeyed to the Promised Land, it was inevitable they would come into contact with their enemies. It was a slow and difficult journey for a people who numbered in the tens of thousands. As they journeyed, the Canaanite king of Arad, a formidable foe, attacked the Israelites and captured some of them. The king was said to have slept on a large iron bed around 13 feet in length. He was described as bigger than Goliath, a well-known giant referenced later on in the Bible. The people, fearful but determined, prayed and trusted in God. God heard their plea and delivered the Canaanites into the hands of the Israelites. The fearsome king of Arad and his army were defeated, so the Israelites claimed their land as part of their territories. Continuing forward, Israel reached the land of Arnon, bordering Moab and the Amorites. They sought peaceful passage through the land of Sihon, the Amorite king. They only wished to use the king's road to pass through his territory and would not eat any of his food or drink his water. He refused. The king gathered the entirety of his mighty army and attacked Israel, but the Lord assured his people's victory. The Israelites defeated the king and seized his lands and settlements, then continued their journey. As they ventured toward Bashan, the king of Bashan and his army confronted them in the Battle of Edrei. God once again assured victory, and the Israelites overcame their enemies. Pushing forward, the Israelites reached the plains of Moab and set up camp across from the city of Jericho. Establishing the Promised Land was almost within their grasp. But there was one more king who had been watching the Israelites' movements. Balak, king of Moab, observed the Israelites' victories closely. He had heard their God traveled with them and became full of dread. Determined to succeed where neighboring nations had failed, he devised a plan with the Midianite elders to destroy them. After having triumphed over Arad, Arnon, and Bashan, their victories spread fear among the remaining nations, particularly Balak, king of the Moabites. The Moabites were descended from Lot's cursed relations with his daughter. They had close cultural and trading ties with the Midianites, a primarily nomadic people who were descended from Abraham's relation with a servant. God warned the Israelites not to harass or provoke the Moabites to war, as their land was also allocated to them by the Lord by virtue of their forefather Lot and his uncle Abraham. After all, it was Yahweh, the Hebrew God who was revealed to Moses during his time with Jethro, the Midianite priest. The Midianites, though, sided with the Moabites and conspired with them. In doing so, they betrayed Israel, and so a new enemy alliance was formed with the Moabites and Midianites. Together, they devised a plan to seek the help of the prophet Balaam to curse the Israelites. Balak sent elders from Moab and Midian as messengers to the prophet Balaam, offering him a substantial reward to curse the Israelites. With the distinguished guests in his home, Balaam, in prayer, sought guidance from God. God forbade him from going with the elders to curse the Israelites, emphasizing that the Israelites were a blessed people. Upon receiving Balaam's rejection, the king was undeterred. He sent more distinguished officials to Balaam, promising even greater rewards. Balaam prayed to God again in spite of himself. This time, God permitted Balaam to go, but instructed him to speak only what God told him. Balaam prepared his donkey in the morning and traveled with the officials to Moab. But God, who knows all things, saw something in Balaam's heart and sent an angel to block his path. Despite being a prophet, Balaam did not see the angel as it blocked his path, but it was visible to his donkey. The donkey would not progress on the path in fear of the angel, despite several beatings from Balaam. In doing so, his donkey saved Balaam's life multiple times. Finally, God opened Balaam's eyes to the angel, who rebuked him for his reckless path and spared his life only due to the donkey's intervention. Balaam repented, and the angel allowed him to continue with the officials, but reminded him to only say what God told him to. Balaam arrived in Moab, where he was greeted by Balak. Balaam told the king he could only say what God would tell him to say. Persistent, the king took him to a hill overlooking the Israelites' camp. From there, he told Balaam to curse them. However, instead of curses, God gave him blessings for the Israelites. Balak, angered, took Balaam to various locations, seeking a different outcome. Much to Balak's frustration, Balaam returned with repeated blessings and additional prophecies for the Israelites. He said, "May those who bless Israel be blessed, and those who curse you be cursed." In doing so, he spoke a curse to anyone who would make themselves an enemy of Israel, and a curse to the Moabites. The king burned with rage. He refused to pay Balaam, and the prophet returned home. Eventually, Balaam, disobeying God, advised Balak on how to weaken the Israelites. He knew the Moabites committed sinful practices in God's eyes. The Moabites deified a demon patron called Chemosh, who they would worship by virtue of sinful sexual practices, offerings, and human sacrifices. Balaam told the Moabites and Midianites they could make the Israelites lose favor with God if they enticed them into sin and idolatry through the Midianite women. And so, with Balaam's counsel, the Moabites and Midianites seduced thousands of Israelites into committing sin. Despite God's commandments and Moses' warnings, many of the men started to indulge in sexual immorality with the Midianite women. The men bowed and ate the flesh of the sacrifices they made to their deities. God's anger burned against the people, but he did not forget his promise to Abraham. Despite Balak's and Balaam's conspiring to weaken the Israelites, they had inadvertently blessed them and cursed Moab and Midian. They all watched closely as the Israelites started to turn on each other, lose their resolve, and fall into sin. Moses, unaware of Balaam and the Midianites' betrayal, watched in horror as his people yoked themselves to demonic deities through ritualistic sexual immorality and sacrifice. As the once feared people of God began to bow to other deities, they broke the covenant they made with God. And so, God began to turn away from the people he had sought to set apart in the world, and a fierce plague raged through the settlement. God did not choose to set the Israelites apart because they were such great people or morally superior to others. He had chosen them because of an unwavering promise made to their ancestors. He had chosen the least of people, slaves, to liberate from their unrest and turn into a great nation so they would inspire others to turn away from sin to the Lord. As God watched the Israelites choose other gods before him, he said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of these people and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord so that my anger may turn away from Israel." Moses went to Israel's judges and commanded they destroy anyone who indulged in depravity and sin. He understood that evil is something you have to actively root out. If you allow evil to go unpunished, it will fester and grow in communities. Left unchecked, it may even become difficult to distinguish good from bad, right from wrong. Once the people saw their neighbors and cattle falling to the plague, and the judges began to round up those who were sinning against the Lord, they wept as they remembered their covenant with God. Eventually the plague stopped, but not before it had killed 24,000 people in the camp. The Lord blessed those who didn't waver in their faith in him, and told Moses to treat the Midianites, who they had once considered allies, as enemies. It was then it was revealed to Moses, a people he had once lived and traveled with, had conspired to destroy Israel. Moses counted all the remaining people who still numbered in the hundreds of thousands and prepared for war. But it had been many years and many battles since the people had fled Egypt. Moses was now an old man. he knew his time was near. In solitude, Moses atop a mountain looked at the promised land from a distance. There, the Lord reminded him he would need to appoint his assistant Joshua as his successor, who would see the people to the promised land. Moses was told he would not make the journey there. With a quiet resolve, he descended the mountain and announced Joshua as his successor to the people. Once this was done, the Lord said to Moses, "Take vengeance on the Midianites. After that, you may rest." And so Moses told the judges to arm the fighting men, and they went to war against Midian and defeated the 5 Midianite kings. Among those destroyed was Balaam, the prophet who had betrayed God and his people for gold. The Israelites took all the Midianite plunder and destroyed the towns and people. They only spared those they could prove had not participated in the betrayal and seduction of Israel. In those days, it was common to destroy entire settlements once a victor was named during a war. Take, for example, the Vikings who colonized much of the north of England, utterly decimating their opponents, or the Aztecs who destroyed their enemies, men, women, and children, to prevent any potential for future uprisings. King Balak watched in terror as his plans and closest allies became undone. The Israelites had never planned to interfere with Moab lands due to their close history, but due to his actions, ignoring warning from God and scheming against God's people, he cursed his nation until its eventual destruction. But that's a story for another time.
The victory over the Midianites and their conspirators reinforces the importance of trusting in God's guidance and following his commands. Despite all of Balak's plotting, every action he took only accelerated the eventual downfall of his people. Balaam never got time to enjoy the spoils of his betrayal before he was put to the sword, and the Midianites ultimately paid the ultimate price for their betrayal and sinful practices. Why do you think God still punished the Israelites, even though they were plotted against? Why do you think God reminded the Israelites that he had not set them apart because they were such a great and noble people? Do you remember why God had promised that land to the Israelites in the first place? Finally, when God sent the plague amongst the people, what do you think it told the people about who was the ultimate authority? You've been listening to Verse to Flicks.